Have you ever paid a lot for a bottle and wondered whether you would have enjoyed the same wine if it had been half the price? What if the entire legal framework protecting Champagne, Burgundy, and Bordeaux had less to do with the taste of the wines and more to do with power, privilege, and landowners who needed a very elegant excuse to charge you more money? And have you ever wondered whether the winemaker whispering to you about their living soil and cosmic forces actually believes any of that, or it's just they're very good at making you feel like you're in on something magical? Well, tonight you're going to get the stories and tips that answer those questions and more in our chat with our guest, whom I'll introduce momentarily. If you're joining me, please, in the comments, get in there. Let me know where you're logging in from, what's in your glass, what's the weather like. I'm Natalie McLean, and I teach online wine and food pairing courses. And you've just joined one of the most passionate groups of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. Now, I'm live streaming this video for the very first time on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, but it's based on a recorded conversation I had with our guest for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk. However, I will be here in the comments live with you. So jump in there and let me know. And of course, if you're here on the live stream, I want to hear from you. What tips or takeaways are you enjoying? What questions do you still have? Please let me know and I will respond. Now, just before I introduce our guest, let me say that two of you are going to win a copy of his terrific new book. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know you'd like to win. I'll choose two people randomly from those who contact me. All right. Back to our guest. Alan Ramey is co-president and co-owner of Ramey Wine Cellars. He has been trained in all aspects of the winery, and he competed on the blind tasting team for the University of Cambridge. And he joins us now from his home in Sonoma County. Alan, we're so glad you could join us here. Welcome.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Hi. And I'm pronouncing your last name correctly? Ramey?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Just want to make sure of that.
Thank you.
All right. Now, this book is fascinating. Tell us in a nutshell what it's about and what, say, makes it different from other books about the wine industry. Or you cover a lot of ground, so can you encapsulate it if possible?
Yeah, I think I love reading about wine and read a lot of other wine books, but I was always missing the book on the more controversial, difficult topics. You know, you read a textbook on wine in school and it's all very technical, or then you go to sommeliers and it's a little more about the restaurant scene or blind tasting, or then you have books on wine regions, and they tend to, the commonality amongst those and some others is that they interview wine professionals, people like myself or so many others. But what drew me into wine in the beginning was that, wine covers so many topics. It's microbiology, it's botany, it's philosophy, it's psychology, and so much more. And I'd never found a book that encapsulated that sort of totality of it and interviewed so many of the experts in those fields and brought it together around the topics that we don't agree on. Most wine writers want to write what they know about.
Sure.
I wanted to write what we couldn't figure out and then just let the reader decide what they thought on the issues.
I love that. So you interviewed about 100 people for this book. Many of them strongly disagreed about the topics in question, which is excellent. What was it like interviewing people with such differing opinions?
Oh, it was fascinating and confusing. I think it was funny going from one who acted like this was the only way wine could be made, and then talk to another person the next day who just thought that was a terrible idea for lack of expletive. And couldn't live with it. So yeah, it was confusing because I just kept on thinking both people are intelligent, both people seem very nice and well-meaning, and yet we can't seem to disagree. So I've always been fascinated by that nexus, and again I tried my best to not put my opinion out and just let the reader decide what they think on that.
Did anyone change your mind about any of these issues?
Oh gosh, I think it's more that I just learned a whole lot more and gained a lot more nuance. I think, growing up, I was trained by my dad, who has very strong beliefs about how wines should be made, and that's my upbringing. And so for me, it was just great to get a lot of different influences and people that might have other takes and learn more of the subtleties of that area.
And was your dad's strong opinions a prompt for making you want to write this book?
Oh yeah, I think, when you my upbringing is in Ramey, the winery, and the way we do things is very scientific. Everything has to have a controlled trial and experiment before we make any change at the winery. That's always the way it's been. Every year we're doing trials in the cellar to see if there's some micro adjustments, but we would never change anything without a scientific trial. And so I think for me it was fascinating to learn about not everyone having quite that level of rigor, and yet it was sometimes eliminating to learn that different perspective.
Fascinating. Okay, so your research, the book, required fairly advanced literature reviews, scientific literature reviews. What was it like reading so many scientific papers, and did you have a method in terms of reviewing them all?
It was difficult, and I'd say that was one of the things that also inspired me to write the book, is that it seems like the barrier to entry for opinion in wine is quite low. It's quite easy to have an opinion, and assuming you're a sommelier at a certain restaurant or at a winery, a winemaker at a certain winery, there's often not a lot of pushback because there's a sense of knowledge with those positions. But being born on the inside, I often found that, you do see people saying things without that validation, and so I was interested in exploring more of getting into those other aspects, and I think that's where it landed.
Okay. What was the most surprising thing that you discovered while you were writing the book? You covered so much ground. What stands out for you?
I think, honestly, the organic chapter, that was probably the most difficult. And again, getting back to the research, I mean, it was difficult because there's so many papers written on it with so many different subfields of science, and so that was a challenge. And I think sometimes what I was most surprised by was the fact that there wasn't as much published research as I thought. I mean, some people in organics have, or who are against organics, vice versa, have very strong beliefs. One example would be, there was one gentleman I spoke to who said we would never use synthetic fertilizer because of the CO2 emissions that brings as a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry, and so therefore that's obviously the most environmentally damaging. I talked to another gentleman who hates organics, and he said, well, if you use these really ineffective organic treatments, you have to do so many more spray passes, you have to hire way more people, you have to use more machinery, way more tractor passes, and it's obvious that creates more emissions, even because you have to use so much more material and ship it in. And then I would do the literature review and look it up and realize, oh, well, there's only like a couple studies. And then I would call up the researcher. In this case, it was the University of Geisenheim, who'd done a really interesting field trial on this. And it said one more tractor pass, and there wasn't much else research on it. And that was just one field study in one place for a specific variety. So it's always hard to take that study and then infer, oh, therefore we know this to be certain in other climates. And so it seems like there was just a lot of belief without necessarily the surety that backs it up.
Okay. All right. So you grew up inside of one of California's most celebrated wineries, Ramey Wine Cellars, and yet you initially didn't want to be in wine at all. You wanted to be a diplomat, if I understand correctly. Tell me the trajectory of where you went, because you attended Oxford and then Cambridge, two of the most celebrated universities in England, and then back to the crush pad in Halesburg. Put that together for me. How'd that happen?
No, it was a couple things. One was, I sort of had an idea in my head of what diplomacy was like, and I'll just say the more time I spent in Washington, D.C. looking at that, the more I realized you don't necessarily accomplish all those glorified things. And I still remember I was an intern, and there was one of the gentlemen who headed up the Russia desk right after the Cold War, and he just said we were doing all this planning and everything, and then we got a call that Bill changed his mind and we completely shifted. And so it's Bill Clinton, of course. And
yes.
Then, and then there's a lot of the diplomacy spots. The ambassadors are really political appointees. I mean, it's half of them are about donors for the political party, both Democrats and Republicans. So I just felt the more time I spent in D.C., the more I felt a little worried about the actual efficacy and change you'd make in the world. But at the same time, I just fell for wine as the other part of it. I was at Oxford, as you said, and I did a little bit of their blind tasting sessions. I didn't stay for the team, but just checked in. And then we'd have dinners, and I could legally drink for the first time. I felt like I got away with something. I was under 21 and drinking, which for an American is pretty good. I just started, again, all these different fields of biology, chemistry, history, culture, foreign languages just started capturing my attention. And I thought, well, this seems like a really interesting way to live life. And so I sort of fell for it and never looked back.
Wow. Yeah, it looks like you made the right decision. Diplomacy, politics versus wine. Yes, moving right along, though. This is a wine podcast. You write in the book that your father instilled one iron rule. Any idea about proving wine? Okay, we talked about the experiments. And then you described being stunned when you entered the broader wine world and discovered not many people work that way. Can you give me a specific example of a really audacious evidence-free winemaking claim that kind of stopped you cold? You've mentioned organics. Is there something else along that line?
Oh yeah, just the nitpicky day-to-day stuff. I mean, like corks, for example. I mean, the number of wineries where they'll change their cork supplier just because the sales rep is a charming individual, and they don't do all the research to know what the oxygen transfer rate is, what the actual coloration effects are, and so it's just something like that. Or sulfur dioxide, one of the factors brought up in the natural wine chapter, where a lot of people will be vociferously for or against it and have long claims about ageability, but they don't necessarily have the trials in their cellars saying, look, here's the rates of SO2 that went to the bottle. Let's measure it every single year for 20 years, see what that aging trajectory is, taste it to confirm what that evolution is. Is it aging? Is it not? And then adjust winemaking because of that. So I think there's things like that where it seems like there wasn't a lot of research in those areas. So that's I think the benefit and my privilege of coming from a winery that has a little more of that cultural rigor, I'd say.
Yeah. Now, you were a competitive debater in high school and at university. You won Best New Debater at Oxford. Wow. How has that background in structured argument shaped the way you read the wine trade's biggest claims, or even your approach to winemaking?
Well, I think you just, you go into things with a lot more skepticism. I mean, you hear claims, and I think because you've spent a lot of time with some smart people who have to tell you you're wrong and you have to fight back. I think you're a little more grounded in just thinking through the logic of everything and saying, wait a second, that was a claim, but it didn't have a warrant. What's the actual, and then what's the impact? There's a little more of if you do it for years and years and years, you just sort of start to think in a little more of a technical way about the things you hear, and you're just more used to pushing back than I think without that. I'm not saying others don't or can't do that. That's not what I'm. But you just get a little better at it. I'd say a little more comfortable with it. And so I think when I took that and then I entered the wine world, it seems like, gosh, it's so politicized in many ways. And so there really were a little more parallels to, I'd say, kind of policy debates than I expected, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you competed on the Cambridge blind wine tasting team. What did that experience teach you that maybe you couldn't have learned any other way?
Oh, it was fun. It's, I think I took it with two ones. One, I purposely didn't tell them I came from a wine background because I wanted to sort of get on the team on my own merits. So I think a lot of people in wine tend to lead with, here's what I know and I'm going to tell you. And I very much sort of tried to limit that until I think there was one final time where we were in a social setting and I just couldn't, I didn't want to lie. So I finally revealed. So yeah, for me, it was part of a great blind tasting education. It was a great team, but also kind of a cultural view into British tasting and how that is different than American tasting. I'd lived and spent some time in Chile and France prior, so it was a nice insight into another culture. And I think anytime I've gone to another country, there's just a different focus on what to drink. And the Brits, I think, don't drink as much California or Oregon wine versus here in California. It's obviously front and center. And so it's kind of nice to be put in a position where you're reminded that you're not the center of the world. I think that's a healthy thing that we should all go through in life. And so I think it's a different focus, but a good cultural learning. It's hard to conclude because there's a lot of other things, but I think those are probably some of the big two.
Sure. And do the Brits have a different approach to tasting wine, no matter what it is, than, say, Americans or other cultures?
I think I get into this a little bit in the values chapter of the value of or taste of good taste. I think I grew up in a culture where if there's any tiny hint of oxidation, that is a fault, and that wine should be poured down the drain. And the Brits, God, they love aging wine. And so I still remember I was at a dinner and there was all these old Dons all around me and who'd been drinking their whole life in the fine dining hall, etc. It was kind of like one of those like Harry Potter style, rooms, dining halls. And I'd gotten invited by an elderly professor who was very kind to me, and the wine went around and it was clearly oxidized, but they were all loving it and having a great time. And I called for a new bottle, and they drank it. And I just remember sort of the look of puzzlement on their faces and realizing how different it was. And I just realized that's a culture where if it's a little more oxidized, a lot more people are okay with it. And not everyone, of course. I don't want to generalize. I think there's some that are quite different. But yeah, I think that's something where when I interviewed Stephen Brooke for the book as well, he mentioned the same thing about Australia. When he was judging in Australia, he would find the Australians were very technical about any possible fault, whereas he was a little more, I'd say, open with a little more Brett or a little more oxidation. And so I think that, putting yourself in different cultures shows you that some things that we oftentimes think are ideas of absolute qualitative difference might not be the same in another place or for another group of people.
Sure. Well, the iconic or maybe cliche bottle is the bottle of sherry behind the books in your Don's tutorial or whatever.
Exactly. You got it. That's right.
It's very oxidative. Okay. So you did harvest at Veramonte in Casablanca, Chile, and Domaine Mio Camuzet in Burgundy. Those are very different worlds. What surprised you about those two places, in terms of how they think or approach questions of soil, climate, winemaking? I know it's more complex, but if you can summarize or give us some insights.
No, it's tricky because I think Chile is so, underrated in its wines. I think, as I mentioned, when I went to the UK, it was a very different drinking culture where Californian wines weren't as present. And I think growing up in California, I didn't realize until I went to Chile that most of the import scene is more cheap, affordable things. And I think that's the view of Chile for many. And yet when I was down there was all these really interesting microclimates and interesting people, small producers that weren't able to gain entry in the export scene because of how difficult that is. And I just realized what a beautiful, interesting, diverse place with all these cool cultural movements it was, and we just don't seem to appreciate it as much. And so I gained an appreciation for the underdog and what they can do, and that unless you go to a country, you should never truly have a I know everything point of view. You need to taste around a little bit more. So I think that was the main lesson for me there. And in Burgundy, I still remember in my interview for the job, I told Jean-Nicolas, my future boss, that I wanted to learn classic Burgundian techniques, and he schooled me right then and there and said, there's no one way to make Burgundy, and I think it was a nice reminder that it's a place that obviously I think so many times people say, oh, I love Burgundy, and it's like the more you go there and learn the different techniques and the different styles, you realize there is no one Burgundy. In hindsight, I realized my mistake was that to say I love X place, you're really saying you love this whole different panoply of options, and it's better to be a little more precise and specific and say, well, what style of wine do you actually like? Because sometimes that's in Burgundy and some other places too in the world, and so I think that was the main eye-opening thing there, amongst others.
That's true. Like, even regions contain multitudes. No one wants to be summarized into a cliche. And it's also true that a lot of what happens in the country doesn't ever get exported. All the differences and all the little gems and everything else that you don't experience unless you go there. So that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
So you raised the question of whether human intervention should be part of the definition of terroir, that fancy French term that is defined in many ways by many people, but some sort of combination of climate and soil, geography, etc. Daniel Roberts, a soil scientist whom you interviewed, said there's nothing more destructive to terroir than winemaking. Can you tell me about the specific wine you tasted where winemaking had overwhelmed maybe a sense of place? Or you don't have to name names, or we don't have to do wine shaming, but like, what's your take on his statement, which is pretty provocative, first of all? Nothing's more destructive to terroir than winemaking.
Yeah, I think I mean, I do think there is just a growing consensus in the industry of just anything that's over oaked and over extracted and overripe tends to
Right.
kill it. And frankly speaking, I think that's a fairly widespread knowledge at this point, which is why so many regions around the world are pulling away from that. I still remember chatting with a wine journalist who said they'd gone down to, I believe it was Argentina, and they thought they'd found this really interesting story that, oh my gosh, everyone I'm talking to down here is making more restrained wines that are a little lighter, and what an interesting expression. And this writer told me that they went back to the story to their editor, and the editor said, "Yeah, welcome to the world. Every region is doing that." So I do think that the world has learned a little bit of a lesson and is moving in the right way. But that said, I do think there's still some wines that you realize are, I guess, what you'd call Franken wines. Where it's like you smell it and you get like, wow, this is really overripe. This is hugely, overly late picked grapes, and then you analyze and you realize, wait a second, I'm thinking about the alcohol, and we have a lab downstairs where we analyze a lot of things, and it's like 12.5 alcohol. So you just know that they de-alked, and that's like kind of a you can't really use your deductive reasoning skills to bring that home to a place, because it's just that doesn't make sense together. And so I think those are the wines that we've all had and sort of scratched our heads at, and I honestly think, I know my backyard in California is moving away from that trend with a lot of intelligent producers, and so I think that's happening around the world too.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you've tasted wines where they're extremely ripe and big, big on the nose, but then the alcohol level doesn't line up with that, so they've de-alcoholized the wines. That's interesting. Okay, the anthropologist Marion Desmosiers calls terroir a strategically deployed myth and says it is an artificial construction with nothing to do with taste or quality, used by the elites to empower themselves. That was interesting. How do you respond to that, or what are your thoughts on that as someone who both makes wine and who writes about it?
No, it's tricky because, again, growing up, I mean, so much of the Ramey culture was you blind taste against other wines, and then we have an Excel sheet and we rank them, and we try to assure we have an understanding of what goes where and what the qualitative differences are. And so I think there's a genuine sort of hope that the world is based on taste, and that terroir is a real thing. I think that's most people who love wines. I think that's the dream. But I think talking to Marianne and some others, you realize that there are other forces that shape wine regions, and that delimitation of boundaries and what is defined is oftentimes not based on a objective scientific criteria of what should be. And I think writing the book, I realized that a lot of places that are where the regions were established a long time ago, it was oftentimes people that were quite powerful in those areas that had the political savvy to draw the boundaries where they were. And that's not to say there isn't terroir is therefore not real, but it's to say that we ought to be a little more skeptical about the idea that this is the only climate or soil in the world that can make that kind of wine. I mean, just last week I had a friend who was in the Danish blind tasting competition, and apparently our wines got put in, and everyone was guessing they were Burgundies. And I think it's a nice reminder that I think anywhere there's a cool climate in the world, whether it's California or New Zealand or Australia or others, that there are more similarities than we sometimes like to admit. And I'm not saying it's impossible to taste past and try to determine it, but it's often, I think it's a lot closer than many would like to believe. And I think that's explained by the anthropological or sociological scholars that are out there doing great work on this. And I think they deserve to. Marianne's a great writer, and I think more people should be reading her stuff.
And would you say the 1855 classification of Bordeaux is pretty much kind of aligned with that? It was just, if I understand correctly, based on which wines were getting the best prices, right? The highest prices at the time?
So that's absolutely right. So yeah, I think there's a very strong critique of that method. I want to allow for the people who would be in favor of it to advocate for that and say that there is something about the history of an estate or a place that might be able to last through the generations. I think there's definitely an argument on that side, but I think most people that would be analyzing that system would have a pretty strong critique to say, well, look, the prices for wines at any given one time in history ought not be a determinant of fate for the next 1,000 years. I mean, in our backyard in California, we see prices going like this all the time, where a cult producer emerges, but then it turns out it was just an investor group, and there's no long-term interest, and so it folds. And so I just I think there's now more than ever there ought to be a little skepticism about price-based determinants of quality.
Yeah, for sure. Shadow Cheval Blanc and Shadow Hassan voluntarily walked out of the Saint-Emilion classification of 2022. You described their complaint that under the new rules, quote, we would have had to get an Instagram account, quote, unquote. What does that moment reveal about where wine region rules are heading?
Well, yeah, I remember that was the gentleman from Cheval Blanc when I was toured over there to learn a little more about it. And I would caveat that by saying there's even before that there's multiple thoughts. I mean, some people might say that's an excuse to get out of a system that was no longer favoring Cheval Blanc as the top of the stature. And so I think I want to acknowledge that critique before proceeding. But that said, I do think that specific example brings up that question of, well, we thought these places were all about terroir and codifying and creating a sense of place, and so why are all these other rules being attached to it? And I think, frankly speaking, I do think in hindsight you could predict it, because the moment you get a place-based wine and people realize that is a value creation, that you can charge more money for it, it's more interesting to sommeliers, you get more cultural cachet, of course people want to copy that. And so there's so many new either AVAs in the United States or DOCs, Gs in Italy, or other place-based constrictions in the world. And I think Andrea Massalaglio in the UK did some interesting work, Zappalaglio, excuse me, where he said there's all these almost ghost regions in Italy where almost no wine is made, and they just created it because there was a good marketing thing at the time, but it didn't actually have the historical stature to have something that was distinctive. And I think in a world where there's more and more quote-unquote special places, I think that begs the question, if everything is special, then nothing's special. And that means that the regions that do have that history, or anyone who wants to be gotten their attention of, needs to fight that much further in the wine marketplace, so to speak, to gain that attention. And so I think that sort of marketing add-on is kind of a logical conclusion of that almost terroir war, if you will, of who will gain the attention of drinkers in the day. And so I can understand the forces that have led them to create it, because if you don't get attention, then those wines don't have higher prices, then your economy doesn't do as well, and people are out of a job. And so I can understand that base idea of why you'd want to come up with that. And yet I think there's almost a sense of innocence lost for many drinkers when they hear that story, where they thought it was this innocent little farmer who was just tilling their land, and it's just as simple as that. And I think that's why I wanted to express that story in the book, is to tell readers that there really is a little more of an organizational apparatus that is behind what gets into their glass.
Fascinating. The historical geographer Tim Unwin, called the act thank you, called the act of drawing wine region borders, quote, the delimitation of privilege. You described the Napa AVA boundary fight in detail, including the phone book argument. What was the phone book argument?
Oh yeah, gosh, I think there was a huge debate when Napa was being turned into a region, because the wines historically that had been bottled as Napa, and this goes back to the 1800s and pre-prohibition, I mean, there weren't rules. So you would have a Napa wine, but it might have grapes from Lake County or Sonoma or Mendocino that would be added in. And so of course the first rule was the county barriers, which, to be frank, were a little arbitrary because they weren't drawn for wine-based rules. They were political decisions in the 1800s. But then there's that question of all these, it's Napa Valley AVA is what they wanted the name to be, but there's several other valleys all around that historically had their fruit going in. And so the question was, how are people, what does Napa Valley mean? Is it interpreted literally as this one specific valley, or should it be interpreted more broadly how it often was used? And so lawyers were going back and forth, and they used the phone book because they had changed it from Napa County to Napa Valley to reference a wider region, and that was used as evidence to show that this is common knowledge amongst people of that this name Valley is actually a little broader than it should be. So that ended up winning the day, and it was interpreted, Pope Valley and Childs are now included in Napa Valley, even though you'll notice it's not the Napa Valley's AVA, it's the Napa Valley AVA. And similarly, there were some who argued if it's Napa Valley, that's the valley. There should be two regions. It should be Napa Mountain AVA and Napa Valley AVA. And in that case, again, it was they decided to interpret it in a broader place-based system as opposed to a literal interpretation. So, but that was hugely important because those valleys that got excluded from Napa, of course, their economic prospects are dismal. And I think the people who wanted the purity of one place would argue those might not be as good places or are too hot, and I think there might be technical reasons for that, but I think there's also a fairly strong economic incentive. It's obvious to say that the narrower a region might become, the fewer people can use that power, and then that means the money goes to them. And so I think there's naturally incentives to exclude others that don't bring benefit to that region.
Sure, that makes sense. In 2025, you write that Chateau Lafleur dropped out of the Pomerol appellation in Bordeaux because regional sales were too slow to respond to, regional rules were too slow to respond to the drought and heat. What are the implications? What happened, and what were the implications for the appellation systems everywhere if more prestigious estates start making that same calculation?
I think the implication is you almost turn more into, an Australia or a California where it's if the brand matters more than the region. I think the obvious reason for those strictures had been to create quality standards back in the old days, because if you read your history of 19th century French winemaking, you realize that there was a lot of things blended in and dubious practices and
trucks at night coming in the back door.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, same thing with Napa, as I was just mentioning. It's you use the place name. I mean, Burgundy would have the people who would sell it would say here's a Vin Romanée, but they would say it was more of the style of Vin Romanée, but they were allowed to use other places. And so there was a desire for both economic reasons and for taste reasons. There was that push to create standards and make sure quality was going up, so that once a name got established, people couldn't just jump on the bandwagon, use the name to get the attention of the buyers, but then make a terrible wine that would then bring the standards down for everyone else. And so it was sort of that conflict that created the rules to begin with. So if you raise the bottom standards, everyone should be good. But climate change has really thrown a wrench into that, because if your standards are around a predictable idea of what a region usually is capable of, then it's great. But if you live in a world where you've got these huge striations from hugely hot to very chilly, it's harder to create rules of the road that are standards that you can rely on. And so you end up with decisions like those chateaus are making. And I think we'll see where it goes.
Yeah. So do you think that AVAs and DOCs are going to become a way of the past if, with climate change and with, I don't know, brands just trying to build on their own reputations?
I'd say I think there's ways forward. I think not every region is having as strict rules, and I think departures like this are obvious warnings to those associations to not create stringencies that might exclude people. And so I think there is a logical answer, which is just don't do that. And so I don't think it necessarily means the end. I do think it, as climate changes, and this is the other chapter in my book, I get into the question of whether a changing climate means that the identities of these places are irreparably changed, or if there is some stamp that can last over time. And I think there's arguments on both sides, and I'd let you read the book before I comment on what might be right. But I think there is that tension that's at play right now, and the rules, of course, relate quite closely to that, because climate change and wine rules are tied quite closely together, I think.
Mm-hmm. So let's get on to that organic chapter. You note that Fritz, Fritz Haber, who synthesized ammonia and essentially fed the world with fertilizer, accepted his Nobel Prize in chemistry just 1 year after fleeing from Switzerland over his role in chemical warfare. So the man who gave us modern fertilizer was also the man who gave us poison gas. How does that duality shape the way you think about the organic debate?
Yeah, I use that. The Fritz Haber story had been one used by, I think, several in the organic movement, or at very least there's oftentimes a description of World War II bombs and the association of those and some of the fertilizer, and I think that that's a very uncomfortable thing for many. So I think that's, I used that, I did a little research to color the story a little bit more so that readers can understand that in a little more depth. But I think I used it because it was a common refrain amongst those who are worried about chemicals in agriculture as a whole. And so I think it was indicative of what many feel about that worry of being a little too close to something that is so damaging. I think what the other side would respond with is to say, just because chemistry oftentimes has confusing names, and just because something might have had an association with the same person who invented this also invented something bad, that doesn't necessarily mean that the agricultural chemical is a bomb that is destroying people. So I think there's a pushback saying that that's a simplification. So I use that to just kind of get at that tension at the beginning of the ideas of naturalists and chemicals.
Sure. And what's your own approach at the winery in terms of organic, how do you go about it?
I think, kind of like I said, for the winemaking side, it's case by case and study by study, and so we look at everything and then see what the results are. I think for us, we're in a fortunate position that the winery doesn't need to have extra associations with it for marketing reasons, and so okay. I don't think we need the organic stamp. I think most people who know the winery know that there's a lot of thoughtfulness that goes into our farming, and they know that we're not doing anything that is egregiously harmful to the environment. So I think there's a sort of a trust that we've earned over years of that time. That said, I think that there's biodynamic practices that we've trialed. There's organic practices we've trialed. We have an organic spray program for the spray side, although sometimes depending on what some vines might need, there might be a non-organic fertilizer. So there's the pesticide side and the nutrition side. And I think there was one of the critics of organics from Harvard had said that at first it was just the fertilizer side for organics, and then it was really the 1970s where you started to see this movement questioning chemical use that come in, and it was sort of like organic completely changed at that time. It evolved, I should say. And so I think that we just test everything on a case by case basis, measure the results, make sure everything's done responsibly, but we're very aware of what all those different farming mechanisms do, and we try our best to be respectful and do our research.
Yeah, because I've heard of wineries that have gone for organic certification and put it on their label, but then hit a really bad year where they're going to lose the whole crop if they don't use pesticides or whatever, and then suffer the market consequences of either losing the crop or removing the designation. People going, what are you doing? So mm-hmm. I imagine it's a very it's a hard thing to
exactly. It's quite tricky. It's and in fact, I mean, a lot of people, and this is why I wrote another reason I wrote the book is that I think, if you were making wine in the 1970s, the crazy or brave thing to do would be to go organic, because that was unusual at the time, and so that was, a very odd, almost countercultural choice. Now the sort of weird, brave thing to do or counterintuitive thing to do is to not be organic, because I think organics over the last 50 years has established such a standard for environmental quality that if you're not organic, I think sometimes there's this question of, well, are you just, since you're not fully invested in the boat, therefore you're environmentally irresponsible. Not everyone thinks that, but I think certainly some do, and that is to the credit of the organic system. Consumers don't really know otherwise, and so it is sort of a sense of proof that you're actually doing what you're doing instead of greenwashing. So I think that's one of the better arguments in favor of organics, that it's just a clarity for consumers. With that said, I think there's a lot of changes happening right now in organics. That's what I tried to get the sense of in the book, that organics is not just one thing. Different countries have different organic standards. What is organic in the US is not organic in the EU. The EU just made huge changes with copper. Just was that, last month or so, that are taking a lot of people out of it. And so I think there's that concern as well.
The USDA organic standard permits sulfur as a synthetic because it's derived from petroleum refining, while banning arsenic because it's toxic, even though it's entirely natural. And you write that it's with some irony that a petroleum byproduct is one of the most commonly used sprays in a naturally inclined system. How does that contradiction reveal the limits of how we define organic? So you're getting at that right now, but is there anything else you'd add to that?
No, I use that point because I think so often there's, at least in the sort of marketing side of wineries, it's very, and whether it's an organic winery or not, I think that's very common to say, oh, we don't spray anything, or we don't like chemicals. And yet I think oftentimes they're using chemicals and sort of, I say chemicals when it's something bad, but when we spray it, it's okay. Or sort of just a pretend idea that we don't. Honestly, I think some wineries probably don't even want to talk to their sales staff about that side of the business. And so I think there's just sort of a lack of education and focus on that. I think it's a tricky one because I think that little minor contradiction in the idea of purity for organics has been true from the beginning, because it's just it's a great concept that I think that's why so many people feel for it. Again, when the 1990 organic rule passed the U.S. Congress, it was the most written about program in the ag history for California. So it's clearly people like the idea of purity in their products. I think what the difficult thing is implementing it. And so I think one example would be, for example, in the US, the question was, if it's organic, therefore you should only have organic manure that goes in the grapes. And that was decided back in the 1990s that wasn't possible because there wasn't enough organic manure to be able to get around. And so they said, okay, you can have non-organic manure to go into organic vegetables. And so I think that was one that I think the purists at the time thought was a bad decision, and they would have loved it to be a little more, pure throughout the whole chain. But you can see how there's just a slight, allowance for flexibility for realism. And so I think that's another example of it. I think the sulfur one is another one where you could argue it's a contradiction, but I think the ones who are implementing would say, look, it's not as toxic as other sprays. This allows us to be able to use it in a better way. And I think there's the practical argument that actually mining sulfur in the ground might not actually be a better process than the byproduct from refineries. So again, if you're looking at it in terms of the extraction and the outcomes, I think that there's even though it's counterintuitive, I think some could defend it fairly well. But I think that's, again, I brought that up because I think I can see people disagreeing on both sides of that. And I think it's just a fascinating little insight into sort of the hows of organic became what it is today.
It absolutely is. I think you should have called your book "It's Complicated," though that probably wouldn't have been a good marketing angle. Yeah. Who's going to buy It's Complicated? Anyway, I do like pressing matters. One anonymous grape grower in your book says simply, "Effin' mealybugs are terrible," as their explanation for why they abandon organic practice. Can you describe a specific farming crisis where the idealism of organics ran directly into the reality of trying to save the crop?
Yeah, no, I think there's a few. There's a few pests or weeds that are just so invasive that it becomes incredibly difficult to combat them with the organic arsenal. Mm-hmm. Sulfur and copper can solve a lot of things, but I think what some have realized is that that just means you spray and you spray and you spray and you spray and you spray, but at the end of the day, it's just not powerful enough to stop that. And so the critic would say, you're using so many more tractor passes, you're using a lot more product and shipping it out, so there's the cost there, and then there's all the time wasted too, and the practicalities of not getting it done. So just having something that's a little more powerful to start, in this case mealybugs, which are quite frustrating, or I think on the weed side, fluvelin is one that has been really troublesome here in California for many. So I think that's a worry. I was chatting with a researcher from Cornell who talked about how copper is great, but if you keep building it up in the soil, that actually might be bad for earthworms, which I think we often, it's one of those things that I think most organic farmers would celebrate. I mean, I think that's the beauty of the organic side, is to say, let's focus on our soil quality, look at what we're having. And yet I think if you're put in a certain situation where you're just struggling, that you might actually be harming the thing that you're trying to help. And so I think what this researcher was telling me is saying having a few different options in those extreme situations to be able to get the job done quickly and not have one compound that could build up in the soil, that might be a more intelligent response. So again, it's tricky because I think we want to have a simple, good understanding of how to have a healthy, respectful a wine that doesn't hurt nature and doesn't get leached into the ground or other groundwater. And I think organics is, the beauty of it is it has that clarity. I think the challenge is that you're having one farming system that encapsulates so many different practical agricultural problems or regions. Like again, New York, where the Cornell is closer to, has so much more mildew pressure and different types of mildew that it's much more difficult out there, and your costs are so much higher. And so I think it's that challenge of, you want one standard, and yet one standard is very difficult to have for everyone.
That's true. And now you cite Sri Lanka as an example where a government ban on synthetic fertilizers caused food prices to spike, protests, and a policy reversal. Organic advocates say the transition was just too abrupt. What do you think that tells us about the pace at which organic viticulture can realistically scale?
Well, I think the first and most obvious one is that you can't do it overnight. I think that's the lesson right there. I think the question that I get into a little bit is that there are other governments, the EU and in California, where I am, it has policy statements about goals for percentages of farming that will turn organic over the upcoming years. And the question is, how realistic a goal will that be? And I think that and I found scholars on both sides of the issue here. I think people who are for it, obviously, I think there's arguments to say let's less intensive agricultural, as an average as a whole, it's less intensive farming. There's less potential danger because there's things that are as harshly toxic aren't used as much, and so you might diminish some risks. I think those are the kind of arguments that those advocates would say. On the other side, there was a gentleman I interviewed who said, if the whole world went organic, there just isn't enough manure to be able to sustain that. And so the question is, if it's not a long-term solution, what are we doing here in trying to make that the goal? And so I think that, and again, there's responses to that argument. I don't want to make it end there. It's very complicated and hard to get at in one point, but I reference those as sort of the two top arguments, and then the conversation continues back and forth for quite a while.
Sure. Wow. And then a 2017 Harvard Business School paper you note called Organic Wine, a Case Study in Failed Category Creation. It found that organic wine was more popular by volume in Sweden than in all of the United States combined. Why has the organic wine category struggled to connect with consumers the way organic food has certainly connected with them?
It's tough to say. Well, I think I need to double check that, because I know organic food is quite out there in a lot of grocery stores, but it's still a small minority of most of groceries, and at least in the U.S. I can't speak to outside. The one thing I'd say is I think organic wine has taken off a little more since that was written, but but again, the numbers are still quite low. It's around 5% or much or lower than that globally. And I think, why hasn't it connected? I think it's one of the classic issues is that it's not. Some people make the claim that it is qualitatively better wine when you farm organically, and I think others would say that's not the case, and that it's hard to tell the difference. And the fact that most blind tasting tournaments don't have a is it organic check mark is sort of the perhaps validation for the one side saying it's quite tricky to taste some element. I think a lot of people talk about, oh, there's an energy or vibrancy in this wine, and I think that's the farming. But I think a lot of that is sort of anecdotal and hard to technically define, which is why most of the blind tasting tournaments have steered clear of that. And so I think for a lot of consumers, if they can't taste the difference, if they don't really know it, I think most drinkers just want to have something to drink. And so I think that's the challenge for anyone who cares about creating any standard that allows for more environmental stewardship, is that we just live in a world where there's only so many people that care, whatever farming system it is. And so I think it's really tough, and I think the movement's struggling with that. As I said, right now there's obviously a lot of people who joined organics over the last 20 years and it's grown, but then as we were just talking about, because of practical farming issues, a lot of people very quietly drop off the organic standard and don't make big speeches about it, and therefore it's losing in some elements. So we'll see. I really, maybe it will grow much more, but it's hard to make predictions about the future, so I think I'll probably stop there.
Sure. Now, Ralph Steiner, kind of the godfather of biodynamics, claimed to have communed with otherworldly beings, seen deceased relatives appear and speak to him, and identified two Jesuses. He also said human clairvoyance had been lost due to intertribal mingling of bloodlines. You quote these things not to mock biodynamics, but to lay out the intellectual genealogy of it. How do you think a wine buyer at a top restaurant should hold that history in their mind when a sommelier recommends a biodynamic bottle? Like, how do you balance all of that in your mind?
It's
the history.
tough because I think there's biodynamics has evolved a lot since that time, and I think depending on who you talk to in biodynamics, you'll find people that still use that sort of logical system to come to their conclusions, and then you'll find others who were inspired by some of the tools that were advocated for by Steiner, but justify them using more of a modern scientific understanding. And so I think I think it's just healthy to be aware of where things come from. I think if you study that sort of logical genealogy, what you realize is that it's not like Steiner was this scientist who was saying, let's use this scientific process and that will lead us to it. I think he sometimes said things like that, but I think realistically so much of his other writings show a man who had a very spiritual side that I think has not really stood the test of time for most people. I don't want to say for everyone, but I think it's not like most people follow the religion or spiritual guidance, I should say, of Steiner. And so it's sort of an odd thing where in medicine, some of Steiner's practices have not gone forward. That's been, largely debunked by most modern medical practices. And there's a few schools like Waldorf. I actually went to a Waldorf school in grade school. So there's a few, but most educational systems around the world have rejected sort of the Steiner approach. But with wine, it's kind of an interesting thing because it seems more popular than ever.
Right.
And so it's kind of, I think the question becomes, why is it that wine is the one area where biodynamics has really thrived? And I think there's a lot of different answers to that. I think certainly the advocates of biodynamics would say this is a differentiable farming system and it works. So I want to give, I want that voice to show through. I think there's one of the people I interviewed for my book had said, well, I think if you're trying to differentiate your product and say you're special, it's having a little bit of a spiritual differentiation helps you stand out a little bit. And so I think there's some people that have done it because they realize they need to be different in some way than just being organic. And I think that's when one of the scholars I was talking to was mentioning it, and she was certainly skeptical of the biodynamic side. So I think it's tricky, but I think at the end of the day it's just awareness, and I think awareness about history is always a good thing.
Yes. The subtitle of your book should be "It's Tricky."
Very true. Yeah, it's complicated. It's tricky. Yeah,
that's right. Your marketing group would not approve. Now, excuse me. Nicolas Joly at Coulis de Saron explains yarrow in a stag's bladder by way of the deer's emotional life, the kidney process, Venus forces, and cosmic reception. So he's a believer in using that. And Rodrigo Soto of Quintessa Winery explains the same preparation as inoculating compost to make soil nutrients more available. Both men are using the word biodynamics. Are they making the same product?
Well, I mean, in one sense, they're not making the same product because it's a different place and different grapes. In another sense, I think what you mean by that is, is that does the intentionality behind what you're doing in the farming make a difference? And I think that we can probably answer no. I mean, just because you think something differently doesn't mean chemistry changes, right? So assuming there is something, or if there isn't, either way, I think it's a fairly safe claim to say that in theory it should be having a similar effect. That said, I think a lot of the that would be the sort of pro side of biodynamics, saying it's whatever it is, it's bringing this energy to the wines, and that's the argument. I think the critics of it would say, well, a lot of those preparations are not actually in a level that is strong enough to have any actual effect on farming, and so they would say that everyone is kidding themselves, and that really a lot of the actual effects might be coming from something like a cover crop, that has been a little more studied and does seem to have some sort of effect. And so I think that would be the critique, I would say.
Yeah, and I've heard the argument that whether it's organics or biodynamics, even if you don't believe in, the chemical effect or non-chemical effect, that the winemaker's paying closer attention to the vine, so that's a good thing.
Yeah,
that may be it.
That's the practical argument for those people who do not accept the idea that these applications are having an actual effect, and yet I think a lot of people say, but I seem to keep liking a lot of biodynamic wines. I think the argument is it forces you to pay attention. I know Rodrigo, who's an absolute gentleman and a scholar, I think is very much likes the idea of making himself more connected. And I think if that is the thing that makes him more connected to his vineyard and makes him excited to walk it and observe more, I think there is a logical progression that I think would show that. I think the question also then becomes, are there other things in different farming systems that excite other people to walk their vineyard more regularly and check in? And I think the answer is probably yes. I think not everyone who doesn't have biodynamics is just sort of sitting in an office looking down and never walking their vineyard. So I think that's why a lot of the studies that have tried to measure the difference in biodynamic wines and taste test them blind have been inconclusive. I think some of the trials that are private sector, where it's wineries saying, I've done this experiment, can justify it. But again, usually the academics who've done it have struggled to replicate real world taste differences when they've done field trials. But again, there's not a lot of trials out there, so in theory there could be more research. But the few academic trials that have been done by independent sources seem to show that if there's anything, there might be a tiny difference, but it's possible that that's just scientific noise, is what some of the academics I've talked to told me. And so I think that should be taken into consideration when you're making a decision on that front.
Sure. Take it with an organic grain of salt. So on climate and wine, you alluded to this. Jean-Claude Barraud?
Jean-Claude Barraud.
There you go. Who made Chateau Petrus for decades, says he first noticed the effects of climate change in 1990 when alcohol levels started climbing, acidity was dropping, tannins were softening. You open the climate chapter with him standing at the gates of his winery looking at an 11th century church tower. What specific change has he made to his winemaking in response, and why would that matter?
No, it's a good question. And yeah, Jean-Claude it was important for me to make that pilgrimage because my dad trained under Jean-Claude Barraud actually in 1989. And so I was quite, my dad always spoke amazingly about Jean-Claude as a mentor and an absolute gentleman of wine, and so I was quite curious to finally, as a man, go back and learn a little bit. And he was absolutely, as my dad said, an absolute gentleman and scholar, and so it was a pleasure to talk to him. And then my question was, what was one thing you didn't get a chance to teach my dad in '89 that you would teach me? And he'd said, well, interestingly, you should ask, because in 1990, right after my dad left, that's when he started to see some of those first effects And so what he told me is there was a paper that he'd read where when there's a little more alcoholic expression in wine, that extracts some of the compounds in oak a little bit more. And so he realized he needed to be a little more restrained with his past oak practices because of that academic research. And so he dialed back the new oak. And actually, when I was touring the winery there, he brought in some concrete. So he kept on saying fresh ale, fresh ale, fresh ale, this freshness. And so I think there is very much an interest in moderating in that way.
And because concrete is inert, right? It doesn't impart anything to the wine, or except
in
for
theory, it should not. Yeah, I think there's questions about oxidation in it. So if you have an environment that allows less oxygen in, that changes some of the chemistry, and you could potentially end up with a little reduction in some circumstances. We have some concrete, and so that's when we'll have the same wine in different vessels, and as I taste through, in some instances, I'll notice that. I think it can be managed. It kind of depends on how much oxygen gets in, and I think that's something you can change in the winery. So I don't want to make it sound like it's predestination, but I think that's it's mostly a question of oxygen. But you're absolutely right. It's not like there's vanillins in the concrete that you're extracting and changing, and I think that's part of the appeal of them.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Keys Van Louis. All the names you've chosen here. Did you do this deliberately? Anyway, okay. That person. 2024 Literature Review projects projects that traditional European wine growing regions could shrink anywhere between 20 and 70% by the end of this century. He says you can change some practices in trying to push back a little bit, but you will never go back all the way. And he's referring to climate change. When you read that as someone who makes wine in California, what goes through your mind in terms of the implications of that, both in Europe and in California? Yeah.
Well, I think the question is, he cites that data of that percentage of regions that are shifting, and the question is, well, which ones are staying? And so I think the first thing to answer your question on the mind of any vintner, wherever they are in the world, is gosh, what does my region look like, and how much is this going to get hit by climate? I think we make wine in Sonoma and Napa, and I think so there's a lot of different climate stations around, and again, that's part of the pleasure of making wine in this area, is there's so many different microclimates that are quite different, and so it's fun to draw on that and have different expressions of things. But it also means it's a little complicated, because in some cases it might warm up faster, some slower. I talked to a researcher who talked about how in France there's some places that have stayed much cooler, like Brittany, and some areas like Languedoc that have warmed up a little bit more so. So I think the question over here for us in this case would be, how are we going to change? And I think it's tricky, because what California has is this big Central Valley that gets, if you've ever driven through it to get to Yosemite or anywhere like that, it is just a flat, like a lot of lettuce fields, tomato fields, and it's hot. Right. I think that's why there's fewer quality grape regions, is that it's really harder to justify that as a quality place. But interestingly, what happens is that as that heat rises, that acts as a vacuum that sucks in cool air from the ocean. So you actually get, if in theory, if you think about it, the hotter that gets, you might be drawing in more breezes to come through. Now, that's the theory, and I know there's some people who might try to use that to claim, therefore, Sonoma, a place like that, could actually get colder. But then I want to stop there and be cautious, because we need to look at the data first before you make a conclusion like that. There's not a lot of 100-year weather stations around here. San Francisco Airport has one, but the problem there is that there's so much city effects and concrete that's around it, that some scholars have questioned whether that's a good weather station to use for long term, because there's as the environment around it changes, it might not be a good long term station. So that I think there's caution there. The one I've seen locally has we work with some folks. A gentleman named Scott Knibbelmeyer who was sharing with me some data, some 20-year data on some Sonoma weather stations, and it seems like things are both in some cases heating up more so, and in some cases getting colder, and so the extremes are going more. So the average is staying fairly similar, but springs might be heating up a little more, but he said a lot of that is just a few really hot years that take the average and build it up, as opposed to most years the average doesn't get that high. And so I think that seems to be indicative of a lot of the world, is that the growing degree day average is interesting to look at, but you're just seeing much more variation. So if anything, we'll have to pay even more attention to vintages. We were looking at some data of comparing our vineyard site in the upper reach of Russian River to Burgundy, and I think for the last 5 years, the average growing degree days have been warmer for our vineyard, but in 2024, we were actually cooler growing degree days than anywhere in Burgundy. So I think it's interesting, because if you talk to some climate scientists, they will just say, oh, this is a region that California's warmer, that's than cool climate Burgundy. But it seems like with climate change, you have to pay a lot more attention to this data and realize that, gosh, the cool climate might not be where you most expect it. And so I think, we're paying a lot of attention to that. And I think in my lifetime, we're trying to do viticultural designs that can resist those extreme years. We're keeping our minds open about where those cool pockets might be and seeking them out. So it's an interesting challenge for, I think, anyone in their whatever microclimate it is. But it's hard to use total averages across the world to therefore determine the fate of every unique place. It's a little trickier than that. Again, for your book title might have been a good one.
It's a tagline. No, that's fine. I've heard global weirding instead of global warming. Like, it's just extremes now rather than averages. But I do want to get onto some of the fascinating price stuff that you've so let me group a couple of things together, because some interesting studies. Hildegard Heyman has run her price game for 22 years at UC Davis University, asking students to rank 5 California wines by price. And in 22 years, no one has ever got the order right. So she's never given away the prize bottle of a Chateau Lafite. But then you also note that Antonio Rangel at Caltech University put graduate students in brain scanners and gave them the same wine while telling them it was priced at $5, $10, $35, $45, or $90, and the part of the brain that encodes for pleasantness of an experience lit up at more of the higher prices. And he says it's not hard to believe that this is not affecting their actual experience somehow. So what's your whole take on price and wine? Are we really enjoying a wine more because we think it's expensive? Does that matter? Is it just marketing? I mean, what's your take? That's precisely why I was interested in it, because I think, again, at the winery, we do a lot of blind tastings, and what I found is that, it's like we put our wine in, and then there was the $500 Napa Cabernet, and our Cabernet, priced, not cheap, but I think still, much more affordably, would beat it in a blind tasting. And I think there was always this. Again, how much was your bottle? I'm just curious. How much was your wine?
We range from like 65 to 225. So we have
US.
kind of some more affordable, some less so.
Sure.
Anyway, so we found that sort of thing would happen, and we're certainly not alone. There's a lot of this happening in blind tasting, where the more affordable wine can win in circles, and it was common enough that I think I wanted to interview some of these people or seek out their research and read their papers to understand more. And I think, on the one hand, I think what Hildegard's, you can't really call it a study because it's a little more anecdotal, but I think her what that example would show is that it's in my backyard, there's just been a lot of people who are sort of like, it's the tech guru or the business guy, and he wants to have the most expensive wine, and it's not really about money because they already have money.
Right.
But they just want to have their name on the bottle and have it be expensive. And I think when you're in a climate like that, I think it's oftentimes price is no longer an indication of quality. It's an indicator of ego. And
Right.
so I think consumers should be skeptical of paying the most in that area. Not that there's certainly I think in European places as well, there might be other reasons why prices can get skewed by others, potentially the demarcation of lines or historical money is a factor there too. But I'm, from California, so I'm a little more aware of my backyard. So I think growing up in that climate, I think there was a lot of skepticism towards that. And I think what you could potentially do, it could make Hildegard's test a little more interesting, is to say, let's not necessarily pick the wines that are just right now that price point, but have a history of being that price point for 30 years, and they're selling a certain quantity of mind, meaning that the market has accepted this value for a long time period. So it's easy for someone to charge $1,000 and then it doesn't sell, and then they get rid of the excess, but people who don't know just think it's expensive. But to have that track record of actually moving a wine for that long builds in a little more credibility into the idea that there might be more something behind that. So I think that could be an interesting area for future research on price to value valuation. So anyways, I think that's the one side. But then I think, bringing up Antonio Rangel's study is fascinating, and that's been cited a lot for obvious reasons, that it brings up this question of why am I happy? Is it the thing in my glass, or is it in my head? And I think the answer is we'd like to think it's in our taste. The reality is that it's our head. I think the question is, how much should you choose to sort of take the pill that brings you to that imaginary world and enjoy that, or how much should you push it away and taste wine purely in a technical sense? And I think depending on how each individual wants to live life, they might choose different things. But I think what's true for most people is that even if they choose to want to go to the place and let the experience overwhelm them and have an emotional experience that might not be related to technical tasting, I think most people just don't want to be tricked. They don't want to have the same wine and one being charged twice as much. And so I think that hopefully, again, with more experienced wine markets, whether you have a track record, we try our best to avoid those things.
Yes, absolutely. And then you quote Janice Wang. She tracked Oxford blind tasting students over time and found their preferences shifted toward higher acidity, lower oaked wine as they gained experience, and lined up with the price hierarchy. She says her coach single-handedly shaped the taste of generations of wine tasters. It's a learned behavior, I'm 100% sure. Is trained taste a form of expertise? Do we gradually want to drink more expensive wines even if we don't know the price of them? Do our palates gravitate that way toward bitterness or whatever, acidity?
Yeah. I mean, that is the question that defined an entire chapter in my book, and I present both sides of that question, which is, I think there's an argument to say that a lot of this is culturally trained learnings that is a little more sociological, that is defined by companies and people with certain backgrounds, and that's the one side. And I think the other side is sort of the sensory science world, which is to say, are there certain flavors or a certain type of balance of in this case wine or any food really, that most humans gravitate towards naturally without training? And I think that I present both sides because it's very tricky. I think this is I use the Oxford example because I think Janice is an excellent researcher and a really nice person too, and it was a pleasure to chat with her, and she's done some great work and deserves more attention for her research, I think. But I think it's so hard to tease that apart, because how do you do a study? Let's make another Oxford where in this one you don't have the coach, and let's it's like you can't just make up that. And so it's I think there's a little mystery in there, and I think there's good arguments on both sides, but I think, I try to let my readers decide for themselves what they think.
Sure. Well, we've always heard that, the first taste we develop as babies is for something sweet, so it makes sense that there is something in the physiology happening. But, Peter DeBola, who runs the wine program at King's College, Cambridge, and is also a professor of aesthetics, argues that what makes a wine great, like a great painting, is its ability to command attention over time, to stay in the market, as you were saying, like to charge a certain price perhaps for a long time because people value it. He says the extension of one's attending to the object is one of the main drivers of aesthetic pleasure. Does that hold up in a world where most wine is consumed in a noisy restaurant on a Tuesday evening?
I see where you're leading with the question. I think no is the answer in many occasions. That's very true. But I think that what Professor DeBola was getting at, I think, is, if anything, liberating, because it's a reminder to us that we as humans are not mere receptacles for experiences and tastes and sounds to affect us, and we have no power in it. Our attention is that factor that allows us to derive more or less pleasure from something. You can walk through a museum and be in a rush on your cell phone and not care at all. Or you could stand for an hour at one painting and be amazed. And I think the exact same is true of the wine world, where you can, by slowing down and having that glass in front of you and really thinking about it, that that commands your attention in a way. And I think in theory we like the wine to be so good that you are forced to stop paying attention to other things and you pay attention to it. That's the ideal, right? But I think that the good news, if you choose to take the optimist approach, is to say whatever wine you have in front of you, you can always choose to pay more attention to it and appreciate it for its whatever beauty it has. And so I think that's the way I think perhaps more people should live their lives, if I can make one bold statement maybe.
Absolutely. Be more present for everything, your wine and whatever. Giacomo Tachis makes a great wine. He was asked what makes a great wine, and he closed his eyes, you say, rocked in his chair and said, a great wine is one that by taking a sip and closing your eyes makes you see the immense. Has there been a wine for you, Alan, that has made you see the immense?
Oh gosh, I'm not sure. I mean, it's with poetic language, it's always hard to know if you're experiencing the same person someone else is. But I think that's the blessing and the curse of a little more of a technical approach. Is I think everything you have, you treat with a little more restraint and conservatism. It's sort of like when you talk to professional comedians and they say, I go to a show and I don't laugh at the jokes because I'm just looking at the comedy to study it, and I hear lines like that and I think, how could you not laugh? It's hilarious. But I think I've sort of become that version of a person in wine where you're studying everything so intensely. It can sometimes be hard to just let yourself go and enjoy it. And I think I think for me it's when you bring everything together. It's a wine that is technically, beautiful, and I think you have to have that level of inherent good that comes in with it. And I think something that is hard to have on an everyday basis, something that's a really old wine that is beautiful and aged, and it's just hard to replicate that as on your normal day. And then I think it's the honest truth is, if there's some emotional aspect, if it's like an old Ramey cab that I know my dad and my colleagues put their attention to 20 years ago, and so I think about all that history that went into it, and I appreciate it so much more because I know what went into it. And so I think some of it's in my head and some of it's in the glass, and it's a little bit of both. And I think in that instance I try sometimes to just purely enjoy and reflect. And I think there's a lot of it's at the end of the day it's hard not to enjoy wine, so I find myself sometimes falling into that, and I think I like falling into it, is the truth.
Absolutely. That is the perfect note to end on. But before we do, because this is marvelous, marvelous conversation, is there anything we haven't touched on that you would like to cover before I ask where we can find your book and you online?
Oh, I think, there's, there's a lot of things happening at the winery. We're excited to keep making on. My
future projects and things, yes?
Yeah, we've got with Ramey, I think we're doing our best to have a lot of wines of restraint and balance and elegance. And my sister and I have had the winery for the last 5 or so years now. My parents are still around, and we talk and communicate. So I don't want to pretend like they're dead. No, I wouldn't want that at all. But it's a pleasure to have them. But it's been my sister and I for a little while now, and some amazing colleagues we have. And I think we're if anything, I think we're trying to push ageability even further and show that California wines do have restraints. There are great independent wineries in our backyard, and I think they're worth reconsidering and considering again. And then the other thing is, I think my sister and I have been thinking for a long time, what can we bring to the wine world? I mean, when I joined, I did what my dad did. He learned French, went to France, and brought some techniques back to California, and he learned chemistry, because there was a lot of practical faults in wine, and he was able to fix that. And I think I learned French and went to France, and it turns out that I realized we're making wine in a pretty similar way. I think those cultural exchanges have been enough, and we sort of know what's happening there now. And similarly on the chemistry side, I studied chemistry and was looking at it and realizing, actually I think the wines don't need more chemistry to be better. It's that's not the problem now. So I think my sister and I had this question of, well, what does the next generation bring to wine? And I think we're starting a new project called Curious Ground, where we look at Sonoma and say, look, the classic first history of California wines was, let's take the European paradigms and apply them in this new area and see what that terroir expresses, and sort of celebrate those differences and enjoy more versions of Cabernet and more versions of Chardonnay. And I think that's been sort of the first era of California's history. And I think now that we're officially 50 years after the Paris tasting, I think the question is, well, where do we go from here? And I think what we realized growing up is, Sonoma is not Bordeaux and is not Burgundy, and perhaps we should be making a blend that we can make, that when I bring it back to Europe is something that they can't necessarily make there. And so looking at Sonoma growing up here, I realized one of the things that makes us quite different is the climatic diversity. If you're having a hot day here, you drive out to the ocean and you're cold and you have to put your jacket on. Or if you've got one soil type over here that's volcanic, you can drive right over there and have something that's ancient uplifted ocean floor. So we have a huge amount of soil diversity. And so my sister and I are making a blend that is kind of takes full advantage of that different climate, that blends things together, that comes from all these different areas. That is something that is I think more responsive to our backyard, and that when we bring it over will be something quite different. So we're excited to bring that out. So we're both celebrating the classics and carrying on that legacy of old school winemaking with Ramey, and then we're also trying our best to see what we can create that's different and unique in our backyard right now. So we're doing that's the latest and greatest from out here in California.
That's excellent. That's exciting. And can people visit the winery? Are you open? You have a tasting room?
Yes, just please call ahead, because sometimes it's tricky and we book up. So just as long as you check in well in advance and make your booking, it should be okay.
Okay, we'll put a link in the show notes to the winery website and contact and that sort of thing. And now with your new book, where can people find that online?
So if you go to my publisher's website, Academy de Vin, you'll be able to track it down right there. So if you just Google Pressing Matters Academy de Vin, it should pop right up.
Okay, and I'm sure it's on places like Amazon and Barnes and Noble, like Chapters in Canada. Yeah, easy to get online.
I believe it is, yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Alan, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. We covered a lot of ground. I know it was complicated, but you really helped elucidate a lot of these very complex issues. So I think you've given us a lot to think about. So thank you for that.
And thank you for the interview and everything you're doing for wine. I think it's fantastic, and I hope you continue.
Thank you. Oh, absolutely. Next time we'll have to do this in person.
I very much enjoy that. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, I'll say goodbye for now, but don't log off yet.
Bye-bye.
Bye.